The day my own son called me filthy and slammed the door in my face, I felt every ounce of my life's worth crumble like dry ash in my trembling hands. For a moment, I thought my heart would shatter beyond repair. The word echoed in my mind like a curse I couldn't escape. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. I live alone in a modest but cozy apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the sounds of the city have become my constant companions. Every morning, the faint hum of traffic seeps through my thin windows, the honks of impatient taxi drivers, the chatter of people rushing to their important lives, the distant rumble of subway trains carrying souls to destinations I no longer visit. Yet inside these four walls, my days bleed into a cycle of solitude and quiet despair that I never imagined would become my reality. My mornings begin with instant coffee that tastes like regret and the cold embrace of this small living room, decorated with dusty photo frames containing memories of a happier past. The smell of old paper from letters I've written but never sent lingers in the stale air, mixing with the faded scent of the lavender sachets my late husband used to buy me every Christmas. I wear the same gray cardigan every day now, not because I don't have others, but because it feels like armor against the world that has grown so cold around me. My hands, once steady enough to paint delicate watercolors that hung in galleries across the city, now shake slightly when I hold my morning cup. The arthritis is getting worse, but who would I tell? Who would care? Last Tuesday morning, I received a text message from my son, John. It was short, brutal, and colder than the winter wind that sweeps through Central Park, carrying with it the dying leaves of another season I might not see again. The message read, "Don't come around anymore. You're disgusting and filthy. Stay away from my family." No explanation, no warning. Just a door slammed shut, physically and emotionally, by the child I brought into this world 51 years ago. I stared at those words on my cracked phone screen until they blurred through my tears. I replayed the word filthy in my mind over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. How does a mother become filthy in her own son's eyes? What had I done to deserve such cruelty? I remember when he was 7 years old, his small hand gripping mine as we strolled beneath the golden autumn leaves in Riverside Park. His chubby fingers were sticky with cotton candy from the street vendor, and he looked up at me with eyes full of trust and love. "Mommy," he had said, "will you always be my best friend?" I had promised him then that nothing would ever change between us. Back then, I believed our bond was unbreakable, sacred, eternal. But reality has a way of crawling through the cracks of memory, and sometimes it bites with teeth sharp enough to draw blood from the deepest parts of your soul. You see, I wasn't always alone in this small apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of better days. There was a time when my life overflowed with purpose, when people needed me, when my phone rang with voices that brought warmth instead of dread. But that feels like someone else's story now, like a movie I watched long ago and can barely remember. For 37 years, I was married to Thomas, a kind man who worked construction in Queens and came home every evening with calloused hands and a gentle smile. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Our apartment in Brooklyn was small but filled with laughter, the smell of Sunday roasts, and the sound of children playing in the hallways. Thomas would sit at our tiny kitchen table after dinner, helping John with his homework while I painted in the corner, my easel set up near the window where the light was best. Those paintings were my escape, my joy, my secret language with the world. I painted the city as I saw it, not the harsh, unforgiving metropolis that crushes dreams, but the beautiful, complex tapestry of human stories unfolding on every street corner. Gallery owners in Soho would display my work, and collectors would pay good money for pieces that came straight from my heart. I had talent, real talent, and for a brief, shining moment, I thought I might make something of myself beyond being just a mother and wife. But then Thomas got sick. Cancer, they called it, though the name never seemed big enough to contain the monster that was eating my husband from the inside out. The medical bills piled up like autumn leaves, threatening to bury us alive. The insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. I watched my savings disappear, then my emergency fund, then the money I had earned from my paintings. When Thomas passed 5 years ago, I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. Death, it turns out, is just the beginning of a different kind of suffering. After the funeral, John and my daughter Sarah gathered around the kitchen table of my Brooklyn apartment, like vultures circling fresh carrion. Sarah, always the practical one, spread out papers and documents with the efficiency of an accountant. John sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, already calculating what he thought he was owed. "Mom," Sarah had said, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about your finances. You can't afford to keep this place, and frankly, we're worried about you living alone." I should have recognized the manipulation in her concern, the way she made my independence sound like a burden instead of a right. But I was still drowning in grief, still reaching for Thomas in the middle of the night and finding only cold sheets and emptiness. "I can manage," I whispered, clutching Thomas's favorite coffee mug like a lifeline. John leaned forward, his eyes cold in a way I had never seen before. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The mortgage, the utilities, the maintenance, you're hemorrhaging money. The smart thing would be to sell this place and move somewhere smaller." Somewhere smaller. The words felt like a death sentence. This apartment held 40 years of memories. Thomas's toolbox still in the closet, the pencil marks on the door frame where we measured John and Sarah as they grew, the kitchen window where I used to watch for Thomas's truck every evening at 6:15. But I was tired, so tired of fighting, so tired of making decisions alone. When John suggested I move to the Upper West Side, to a modest apartment he had found for me, it seemed like a reasonable solution. He even offered to help with the move, to take care of the paperwork, to make everything easy for his grieving mother. I should have known that nothing in life is ever that easy. The day I handed over the deed to my Brooklyn apartment, John smiled and hugged me tight. "This is for the best, Mom," he said. "You'll see. Everything is going to be fine now." But fine is a relative term, isn't it? Fine for whom? Fine, according to what standard? I moved into the Upper West Side apartment on a gray February morning, watching the moving truck disappear around the corner with most of my furniture. Furniture that John said wouldn't fit in the new place. Furniture that had somehow found its way to his own home across town. The new apartment was clean and bright, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light. But it felt like a prison cell compared to the home I had left behind. The walls were white and sterile, empty of the photographs and paintings that had made my old place feel alive. John had been very specific about what I could bring. Practical items only, he said. No room for sentiment in this new, improved version of my life. "You'll love it here, Mom," Sarah had said, standing in the empty living room with her hands on her hips. "It's so much easier to maintain. And the neighborhood is safe. You won't have to worry about anything." Won't have to worry about anything. The irony of those words haunts me now, as I sit in this same living room 5 years later, worrying about everything. My health, my finances, my family, my future, my past, and the growing certainty that the people I love most in this world see me as nothing more than an obligation to be managed. The first year in the new apartment was the hardest. I tried to paint again, setting up my easel by the window, but the light was all wrong. And besides, where would I put the finished pieces? John had been very clear that he didn't want the apartment cluttered with my art projects, as he called them. So I packed away my brushes and canvases, storing them in the back of the bedroom closet like old love letters from a life I used to live. I spent my days walking through Central Park, feeding pigeons and watching mothers push strollers along the same paths where I had once pushed John and Sarah. Sometimes I would sit on a bench and sketch the scenes around me with a pencil and small notebook, but even that felt like a betrayal of the woman I used to be. The woman who painted with bold strokes and brilliant colors, who saw beauty in the chaos and hope in the darkness. The loneliness was crushing, but I told myself it was temporary. John and Sarah were busy with their own lives, their own families, their own struggles. They would come around more often once they settled into routines. We would have Sunday dinners again, game nights, holiday celebrations that lasted long into the evening. I held on to these fantasies like a drowning woman clutching a life preserver, even as the current carried me further from shore. The phone calls came regularly at first, every few days, sometimes more. But they weren't the calls I had hoped for. They weren't invitations to dinner or offers to spend time together. They were requests, always requests, delivered with a tone that made them sound more like demands. "Mom, can you help with the rent this month? Business has been slow." John's voice was always clipped when he called, as if talking to me was an interruption in his busy schedule. "Of course, sweetheart," I would say, reaching for my checkbook before he had even finished explaining. "How much do you need?" "Just $3,000. I'll pay you back as soon as things pick up." $3,000. The first time he asked, it seemed reasonable. Everyone goes through rough patches, especially in New York, where the cost of living seems to rise faster than the morning sun over the East River. I had savings from the sale of the Brooklyn apartment, money that was supposed to last me through my golden years. What good was money sitting in a bank account when my son was struggling to keep a roof over his family's head? So I wrote the check, walked to the bank on Columbus Avenue, and transferred the money to John's account. He called that afternoon to thank me, his voice warm with gratitude. "You're a lifesaver, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Those words made me feel useful again, needed, important. For a few days, I walked a little taller, smiled a little brighter. I was helping my family, fulfilling my purpose as a mother. What could be more important than that? But 3 months later, the phone rang again. Same request, same tone, same promise to pay me back. This time it was $4,000, an emergency with his business, unexpected expenses, bills that couldn't wait. And then again 3 months after that, $5,000 this time. His daughter needed dental work, he said, and insurance wouldn't cover it all. I never questioned these requests. I never asked to see receipts or bank statements. I never demanded a timeline for repayment. I simply wrote the checks, made the transfers, and felt grateful that my son still needed his mother, even if it was only for my money. Sarah's requests came less frequently, but with equal urgency. Her requests were always framed as emergencies: car repairs, medical bills, school tuition for the kids. "Mom, I hate to ask," she would begin, and I would interrupt her before she could finish. "Don't hate to ask, sweetheart. What do you need?" And I would give it to her, whatever she needed, whenever she needed it. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We give and give and give until there's nothing left to give, and then we figure out a way to give a little more. The years blended together in a haze of solitude and financial hemorrhaging. My savings account dwindled slowly at first, then faster as the requests became more frequent and more expensive. John started his own construction company and needed startup capital. Sarah's husband lost his job, and they needed help with the mortgage. There was always something, always an emergency that only I could solve. I stopped going out for dinner, started buying generic brands at the grocery store, canceled subscriptions and memberships I could no longer afford. But I never said no to my children. How could I? They were struggling, working hard to build lives and raise families in one of the most expensive cities in the world. If I could help them, if my money could make their lives a little easier, then wasn't that money well spent? The loneliness, though, That was harder to justify. The financial sacrifices felt noble, but the emotional abandonment felt like a slow death by 1,000 cuts. My birthday came and went without acknowledgement. Not a card, not a call, not even a text message. I sat in my apartment that evening, staring at a store-bought cupcake with a single candle, singing "Happy Birthday" to myself in a voice that cracked with unshed tears. When I caught the flu that winter, I lay in bed for a week with a fever that made me delirious with memories and regrets. I called Sarah, hoping she might come by with soup or medicine or just a kind word. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Sarah. Leave a message and I'll call you back when I can." "Sarah, it's Mom." I whispered into the phone, my voice hoarse and broken. "I'm not feeling well. I was wondering if you could maybe..." But what was I asking for? What right did I have to expect anything from her? She had her own life, her own family, her own problems to solve. "Never mind, sweetheart," I said. "I'm fine. I love you." She never called back. The doctor visits became a lonely ritual. Nurses would ask if someone was driving me home, if anyone was helping me manage my medications, if I had family checking on me regularly. I would smile and nod, making up stories about phone calls and visits that existed only in my imagination. The truth was too pathetic to admit, even to myself. My ailments became invisible, not because I was getting better, but because there was no one to see them, no one to care about the steady decline of a 73-year-old woman who had outlived her usefulness to the world. But it was the financial betrayal that finally broke something inside me that I didn't know could be broken. I discovered it by accident, the way most devastating truths are revealed. I was organizing papers in my desk drawer, looking for my insurance documents after a minor fender bender, when I came across a stack of legal papers I didn't remember signing. The letterhead was from a law office downtown, and the language was dense with legal terminology I didn't understand, but I understood enough. The documents showed that ownership of my Brooklyn apartment, the apartment I thought I had sold to downsize, had been transferred to John 3 years earlier. Not sold. Transferred. For no money, no compensation, no payment of any kind. I read the papers 3 times before the full implications sank in. The apartment I had lived in for 40 years. The apartment where I had raised my children and nursed my dying husband. The apartment I thought had provided the nest egg for my retirement. That apartment now belonged to my son. The money I thought I had received from the sale, the money I had been living on for 5 years, the money I had been giving back to John and Sarah in steady installments, that money had never been mine to begin with. It was money John had been giving me from the rental income of my own apartment, money he was handing back to me from tenants who were paying rent to live in what used to be my home. The realization hit me like a tidal wave of ice water, washing away every illusion I had maintained about my relationship with my children. I wasn't their beloved mother who had made sacrifices to help them succeed. I was their unwitting victim, too trusting and naive to see that I was being systematically stripped of everything I had worked for my entire life. I called John that afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice distracted and impatient. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "John," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to ask you about some papers I found. Legal documents about the Brooklyn apartment." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "What about them?" "Why does your name appear as the owner? I thought we sold that apartment." Another pause, shorter this time. "Mom, we talked about this. You signed the papers. You were having trouble managing the finances, remember? This way, I can take care of everything for you. It's easier. But I don't remember signing anything that transferred ownership. I thought I sold the apartment and used the money to pay for this place." "You did." His voice was getting sharper, more defensive. The money you're living on comes from that apartment. I'm just managing it for you. Managing it by becoming the owner? Mom, what's this really about? Are you unhappy with the arrangement? Because if you are, we can discuss other options. Other options. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I could accept the current arrangement, or I could face the consequences of challenging it. And what would those consequences be? Eviction from my current apartment? Complete abandonment by the only family I had left? Exposure of my financial dependence to strangers who would see me as a foolish old woman who had been taken advantage of by her own children? No, I whispered. I'm not unhappy. I was just confused about the paperwork. Good. Don't worry about stuff like that, Mom. That's what I'm here for. I'll handle all the complicated financial stuff so you don't have to stress about it. After he hung up, I sat in my living room staring at the legal documents until the streetlights came on outside my window. The apartment around me felt different now, not like a home, but like a stage set in a play where I was the only actor who didn't know her lines. How long had this been going on? How many other documents had I signed without understanding their true meaning? How many other ways had I been manipulated and deceived by the people I trusted most? That night, I did something I hadn't done since Thomas died. I cried until I had no tears left, and then I cried some more. But these weren't tears of grief or self-pity. These were tears of rage, hot and bitter and long overdue. The next morning brought a moment that would become the fulcrum upon which the rest of my life would pivot. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still in my nightgown at noon, when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from John. Need $8,000 for business emergency. Can you transfer today? $8,000. After everything I had discovered, after the sleepless night spent confronting the reality of my situation, he was asking for more money. Money that was technically mine, but practically his. Money generated by property that had once belonged to me, but was now legally his. Money that represented the last vestiges of the independence I had sacrificed piece by piece over the past 5 years. I stared at the message for a long time, reading and rereading those 10 words until they lost all meaning. Then I did something that surprised even me. I set the phone down without responding and walked to my bedroom, where I pulled out the cardboard box where I kept my most precious photographs. The box was heavier than I remembered, stuffed with decades of memories, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, family vacations and school graduations, quiet moments and celebrations. I spread the photos across my bed like tarot cards, looking for clues about when and how everything had gone so wrong. There was John at 5 years old, his face covered in chocolate frosting from his birthday cake, his arm wrapped around my neck as he whispered secrets in my ear. There was Sarah at 7, dressed as a fairy for Halloween, her face glowing with excitement as she prepared to go trick-or-treating in our Brooklyn neighborhood. There were pictures of Thomas teaching John to ride a bicycle in Prospect Park, pictures of me helping Sarah with a science project at the kitchen table, pictures of all of us together at the beach in the Hamptons during the one summer when we could afford to rent a small cottage by the water. When had the love in those photographs turned to indifference? When had my children's faces learned to wear masks of polite tolerance instead of genuine affection? When had I become not their mother, but their ATM, useful only for the resources I could provide and dismissed when I had nothing left to give? I picked up one photo, a family portrait taken just 2 years before Thomas died. We were standing on the steps of Sarah's house in Queens, all of us dressed up for Easter Sunday. John's arm was around my shoulders. Sarah was holding my hand. My grandchildren were gathered at my feet like flower petals around a stem. We looked happy. We looked like a family. But looking closer, I could see things I had missed when the photo was first taken. John's smile was perfunctory, his eyes already distant and calculating. Sarah's grip on my hand was loose, distracted. Only my grandchildren looked genuinely happy to be there, genuinely connected to the moment and the people in it. I held that photograph in my trembling hands until the paper grew warm from my touch. Then, acting on an impulse I didn't fully understand, I tore it in half. The sound was small but definitive, like the breaking of a seal or the opening of a door that had been locked for too long. The torn pieces fell to the floor like leaves, and I felt something inside my chest crack open, not breaking, but opening, like a flower that had been waiting decades for the right conditions to bloom. I walked to the kitchen, where my phone was still buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from John. But instead of reaching for the phone, I reached for my favorite teacup, the one with tiny painted roses that Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary. I filled it with hot water from the kettle, added a tea bag, and sat down at the table to think. The tea was Earl Grey, fragrant with bergamot and memories. I sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through my body like courage. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to respond to someone else's emergency. I wasn't calculating how much money I could spare or how quickly I could get to the bank. I was just sitting, breathing, thinking, and feeling the weight of my own thoughts without the interference of anyone else's needs or demands. When I finally looked at my phone, there were 6 messages from John, each one more frantic than the last. "Did you get my message about the 8K? Mom, this is urgent. I need the money today. Why aren't you answering? Are you okay? I'm coming over. Answer your phone. I'm at your door." The last message had been sent 10 minutes earlier. As if summoned by my attention to his words, the buzzer rang sharply, followed immediately by aggressive pounding on my door. "Mom, open up! I know you're in there!" I set down my teacup and walked slowly to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the peephole, I could see John's face, red with anger and something else. Panic, maybe, or desperation. He looked like a stranger, this middle-aged man with thinning hair and hard eyes who shared my name, but seemingly none of my values. I opened the door but left the chain latch engaged, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation, but not wide enough for him to push his way inside. "Why haven't you been answering your phone?" he demanded. "I've been texting you all day about the money. Did you transfer it?" Something in his tone, the entitled expectation, the complete absence of basic courtesy or concern for my well-being, crystallized every emotion I had been suppressing for years into a single moment of perfect clarity. "No," I said quietly. "I didn't transfer it." His face darkened. "What do you mean you didn't transfer it?" "I told you this is an emergency. I need that money today." "I know what you told me," I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. "But I'm not going to give it to you." For a moment, he looked genuinely shocked, as if I had spoken in a foreign language he couldn't understand. Then the shock gave way to anger. "Are you kidding me right now? After everything I've done for you? After I set you up in this apartment? After I've been managing your finances so you don't have to worry about anything?" "Managing my finances," I repeated. "Is that what you call stealing my apartment and renting it out while letting me think I sold it?" The color drained from his face, but only for a second. Then it returned in a rush of defensive fury. "I didn't steal anything. You signed those papers willingly. You wanted me to handle everything because you couldn't manage it yourself. And now you're acting paranoid and ungrateful. You're getting old, Mom. You're not thinking clearly." The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to wound and weaken my resolve. But instead of crumbling under the assault, I felt something inside me harden into steel. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said. "And what I'm thinking is that I will not be spoken to this way by my own son. Not anymore." "Listen to yourself," he sneered. "You sound crazy. Maybe it's time we talked about getting you some help. Professional help." The threat was obvious and ugly. If I didn't comply, if I didn't return to my role as the grateful, generous mother who asks no questions and makes no demands, he would have me declared incompetent. He would take away what little control I had left over my own life and lock me away somewhere safe and quiet where I couldn't cause any more trouble. But the strange thing was, the threat didn't frighten me the way it should have. Instead, it clarified everything. This wasn't my son standing in my doorway. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, a predator who had been systematically destroying my life for years while convincing me to be grateful for the privilege. "Get away from my door," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And don't come back. You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You have stolen from me, lied to me, and manipulated me for years. You speak to me with contempt and treat me like an ATM rather than a human being. You have never once asked how I'm feeling or what I need or whether I'm happy or lonely or afraid. You contact me only when you want something, and you threaten me when I don't give it to you quickly enough. That ends today." His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You're making a huge mistake. You need me, whether you want to admit it or not. Without me, you have nothing. Nobody." "Then I'll have nothing and nobody," I replied. "That's better than having a son who calls me filthy and treats me like garbage." The word hung between us in the narrow space of the doorway. Filthy. I hadn't planned to throw it back at him, but now that it was out there, I could see that it hit its mark. His face flushed, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to apologize through tears when he broke something or said something mean. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by a coldness that chilled me to the bone. "Fine," he said. "Have it your way, but don't come crying to me when you're living on the street because you're too stubborn and stupid to accept help from the people who actually give a damn about you." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway like gunshots. I stood in my doorway until I heard the elevator doors close. Then I shut my door and slid the deadbolt into place with shaking hands. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a peaceful evening or the expectant hush before a storm. It was the silence of a bridge burning, of a door closing for the last time, of a chapter ending with no guarantee that another would begin. I walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the table, where my tea had grown cold. But I didn't make a fresh cup. Instead, I sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the city beyond my windows and trying to understand what I had just done. I had chosen solitude over exploitation. I had chosen dignity over family. I had chosen truth over the comfortable lies that had sustained me for so long. These were not easy choices, and I wasn't sure they were the right choices, but they were my choices, made freely and without coercion for the first time in years. The phone rang several times over the next few hours, Sarah calling, probably prompted by John to assess the damage and attempt damage control. But I didn't answer. I needed time to think, time to feel, time to mourn the death of the illusions I had carried for so long about the people I loved most in the world. Later that evening, I walked to my bedroom and pulled out a suitcase I hadn't used since Thomas and I took our last vacation together. I didn't pack it, I wasn't ready to go anywhere yet. But I set it on the bed as a symbol of possibility, a reminder that I was not trapped in this apartment or this life or this version of myself. From the closet, I retrieved my art supplies, covered in dust from years of neglect. The brushes were stiff, the paints were dried out, but they were still there, still waiting for me to remember who I used to be before I became someone else's idea of what I should be. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because my problems were solved, they weren't, but because I had finally stopped running from them. I had looked the truth in the eye and chosen to live with it rather than die slowly under the weight of lies and half-truths and willful blindness. But if I thought the hardest part was over, I was wrong. The real test was just beginning. The next morning brought a phone call from Sarah. Her voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when she was trying to manage a crisis without letting her emotions show. "Mom, John called me last night. He's worried about you. He said you seemed confused and upset, and he's concerned that you might not be thinking clearly." There it was. The opening shot in what I now realized would be a campaign to undermine my credibility and force me back into compliance. If I couldn't be controlled through guilt and manipulation, then I would be controlled through questions about my mental competence. "I'm thinking very clearly," I replied. "In fact, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years." "But Mom, he said you refused to help him with a business emergency. That's not like you. You've always been so generous, so supportive of our goals and dreams." Generous, supportive. The words sounded different now, stripped of their positive connotations and revealed as euphemisms for something much uglier. I had been generous with money that wasn't really mine. I had been supportive of goals and dreams that required my sacrifice, but offered nothing in return. "Sarah," I said carefully, "when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, not whether I could help with some expense or emergency, but how I was feeling, whether I was happy or lonely or scared or sad." There was a long pause. What do you mean? Of course I care how you're doing. You're my mother." "When was the last time you invited me to dinner? Not because you needed something, but because you wanted my company." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, you know how busy things get. Work and the kids and—" "When was the last time you called just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my health, my interests, my hopes for the future? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a resource to be tapped when convenient and ignored when not? That's not fair. That's not how we see you." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Then tell me, Sarah, what's my favorite color? What book am I reading? What do I do with my days when I'm not writing checks for your emergencies? What makes me happy? What keeps me awake at night? What are my dreams for the years I have left?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice small and defensive. I know you like to read, and you used to paint." "I used to paint," I repeated, past tense. "Because there's no room in my apartment for an easel or canvases or the mess that comes with creating something beautiful. Because I was told that art supplies were clutter, that I needed to focus on practical things, that my painting was just a hobby that got in the way of more important responsibilities." "Mom, nobody said that. You're being dramatic." "Am I? Then why are all my paintings packed away in closets? Why haven't you ever asked to see my recent work? Why has nobody in this family shown the slightest interest in the things that make me feel alive and valuable and creative?" She had no answer for that, because there was no good answer. The truth was that my family had reduced me to a single function, provider, and had systematically stripped away everything else that made me who I was. "John thinks you might be getting depressed," Sarah said finally. "Maybe even developing some kind of dementia. The way you're talking, the paranoid thoughts about money." And there it was, the nuclear option. If guilt and manipulation didn't work, if emotional blackmail wasn't sufficient to bring me back into line, then they would question my sanity. They would plant seeds of doubt about my mental capacity, create a narrative in which my newfound assertiveness was actually evidence of cognitive decline. It was a brilliant strategy, really. If I defended myself too vigorously, I would seem paranoid and unstable. If I didn't defend myself enough, I would seem confused and incompetent. Either way, they could justify taking even more control over my life for my own protection. But I had one advantage they weren't counting on. I had lived with myself for 73 years, and I knew the difference between confusion and clarity, between paranoia and justified suspicion, between depression and righteous anger. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not depressed, confused, or mentally incompetent. I am a woman who has finally realized that she has been taken advantage of by the people she loves most in the world. That realization is painful, but it's not pathological. It's healthy. For the first time in years, I am seeing my situation clearly and making decisions based on what's best for me instead of what's convenient for everyone else. But Mom, I'm not finished. I want you to know that I love you and John more than my own life. I always have and I always will. But loving you doesn't mean I have to accept being treated poorly. It doesn't mean I have to give you everything you ask for without question or complaint. It doesn't mean I have to pretend that being used and manipulated is the same thing as being cherished and valued. My voice was shaking now, but not with fear or uncertainty. I was shaking with the power of words that had been locked inside me for years, words that had been fighting to get out and finally finding their voice. From now on, our relationship is going to be different, I continued. I will not be your emergency fund. I will not be your backup plan. I will not be the solution to every financial problem you can't or won't solve yourselves. If you want to be part of my life, it will be because you value my company, not because you need my resources. You're being unreasonable, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Family helps family. That's what we do. Yes, I agreed. Family helps family. But help flows in both directions, doesn't it? When was the last time you helped me with anything? When was the last time either of you sacrificed something for my benefit? She couldn't answer, because the answer was never. In all the years since Thomas died, my children had taken and taken and taken, but they had never given anything back except empty promises and hollow expressions of gratitude. I think you need some time to think about what you really want, Sarah said finally. And maybe you should talk to someone, a professional, someone who can help you work through these feelings. I think that's an excellent idea, I replied. I think I will talk to someone, a lawyer maybe. Someone who can explain exactly what documents I've signed over the years and what rights I might still have. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me that my words had found their mark. The threat of legal intervention was apparently more concerning than the threat of emotional estrangement. Mom, please don't do anything drastic. Let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can, I said. But it will be on my terms this time, not yours. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and trying to process what I had just done. I had drawn a line in the sand, issued an ultimatum, forced a confrontation that could result in the complete destruction of my family relationships. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. But I had also done something else. I had treated myself with the respect that I had been craving from others for years. I had spoken up for my own interests, defended my own dignity, insisted on my own worth. For the first time since Thomas died, I had acted like a person who mattered. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a shower, put on my best dress, the blue one with the flowers that Thomas always said brought out my eyes, and walked to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I spent 3 hours wandering through the galleries, looking at paintings and sculptures and artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen thousands of years ago. Standing in front of a Monet water lily painting, I remembered why I had fallen in love with art in the first place. It wasn't about fame or money or impressing other people. It was about capturing beauty and truth and emotion in a form that could outlast the person who created it. It was about leaving something behind that proved you had been alive, that you had seen the world with your own eyes and felt it with your own heart. When I got home that evening, I pulled my easel out of the closet and set it up by the living room window. The light was different from what I was used to, but it was still light, still capable of illuminating whatever I chose to put on canvas. I found a small canvas that had somehow survived the purge of my art supplies, and I set it on the easel. Then I sat in front of it with a palette of colors that were still bright despite years of neglect, and I began to paint. I painted the view from my window. Not the pretty, idealized version I might have created years ago, but the real view, complete with fire escapes and construction cranes and the ordinary chaos of urban life. I painted it with bold strokes and honest colors, and with each brushstroke, I felt a piece of myself returning from exile. That night, I slept the sleep of someone who had spent the day doing exactly what she was meant to do. But I should have known that my children wouldn't give up so easily. The phone call came 2 days later, and this time it wasn't Sarah or John. It was my youngest grandchild, Lily, age 16, and possessed of the kind of earnest sincerity that can break your heart or mend it, depending on the circumstances. "Grandma," she said without preamble, "what's going on? Mom and Uncle John are acting really weird, and they keep whispering about you when they think I'm not listening." Lily. My sweet, honest, uncomplicated granddaughter, who had always treated me like a real person instead of a walking wallet. If anyone in this family still saw me as more than just a source of financial support, it was this remarkable young woman who had somehow managed to grow up kind and authentic, despite being raised by parents who seemed to value manipulation over honesty. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, and just hearing her voice made me smile for the first time in days. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too. Mom said you were sick or something, that you weren't feeling well and might not be up for visitors. But your voice sounds fine. Are you okay?" Sick. Of course, that would be the story they told. It was safer to suggest that I was physically unwell, rather than admitting that we had had a falling out over money and respect. Physical illness generates sympathy and concern. Family conflict generates questions and potentially uncomfortable truths. "I'm not sick, Lily. But your mom and we had a disagreement about some things, and now everyone is trying to figure out what happens next." "What kind of disagreement?" I took a deep breath. How do you explain to a 16-year-old that her parents and uncle have been systematically exploiting her grandmother? How do you describe financial manipulation and emotional abuse to someone who has never experienced anything like it? How do you maintain appropriate boundaries while still being honest about what's happening? It's complicated, sweetheart. It has to do with money and expectations and the way people treat each other in families. Uncle John said you were being unreasonable about helping with his business. But Grandma, I've seen the way he talks to you. Like you're not even a real person. Like you're just there to solve his problems. Out of the mouths of babes, this 16-year-old had seen and understood something that had taken me years to acknowledge. "What else have you noticed?" I asked gently. "Lots of things. Like how nobody ever asks what you want to do for holidays or birthdays. They just decide and then tell you where to show up. And how they never ask about your paintings or whether you're happy or what you're thinking about. They just assume you're fine because you don't complain. And what do you think about that?" "I think it's mean. I think they take you for granted. And I think you deserve better." I started crying then, not from sadness but from relief. Finally, someone in my family saw me as a complete person with feelings and needs and dignity that mattered. Finally, someone acknowledged that I deserved to be treated with basic respect and consideration. "Thank you for saying that," I whispered. "Grandma, can I ask you something? Are you really okay? Like financially? Because Uncle John keeps talking about how you need him to manage your money, but you've always seemed pretty smart about stuff like that to me." Smart about stuff like that. Another validation from an unexpected source. Whatever cognitive decline my children were claiming to see, it apparently wasn't visible to someone who actually spent time listening to me and observing me without preconceived notions about what I was or wasn't capable of. "I'm fine financially," I said. "Better than fine, actually. I've been careful with money my whole life, and I have more than enough to last me for as long as I'm likely to need it. The problem isn't that I can't manage my finances. The problem is that other people have been managing them for me without my permission or understanding." There was a long pause. "You mean they've been stealing from you?" The blunt question deserved a blunt answer. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. That's messed up, Grandma. Really messed up. Yes, it is. What are you going to do about it? What was I going to do about it? For days, I had been focused on establishing boundaries and defending my dignity, but I hadn't given much thought to practical next steps. I had stopped the bleeding, but I hadn't addressed the underlying wound. I'm going to talk to a lawyer, I said. I'm going to find out exactly what my rights are and what my options are, and then I'm going to make some decisions about how I want to live the rest of my life. Good, Lily said fiercely. You should. And Grandma? If you need someone to go with you to the lawyer or anything, I can skip school. My parents don't get to treat you like crap just because you're family. The fierce loyalty in her voice made me smile through my tears. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or guilt or manipulation, but genuine care and support and willingness to stand up for what's right. Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know. I love you, Grandma. Like, actually love you. Not because you give me money or buy me things, but because you're kind and smart and interesting and you make the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. I love you too, Lily, more than you'll ever know. After we hung up, I sat in my living room feeling lighter than I had in years. One person, one honest, loving, authentic person, had seen me and valued me for who I really was. That was enough to build on. That was enough to give me hope. The next morning, I called a law firm in Midtown that specialized in elder law. The receptionist was kind and professional, and she scheduled me an appointment for the following Tuesday with an attorney named Margaret Chen, who had 20 years of experience dealing with financial exploitation cases. Just so you know, the receptionist said before we hung up, Ms. Chen will need to see any documents you have related to property transfers, financial agreements, or powers of attorney. If you have bank statements showing unusual transaction patterns, those would be helpful too. I'll bring everything, I promised. Spending the weekend gathering documents was like archaeological work, digging through layers of papers and files to uncover the story of how I had been systematically stripped of my assets and autonomy. The picture that emerged was even worse than I had initially realized. The property transfer for my Brooklyn apartment was just the beginning. Over the past 5 years, I had signed documents giving John power of attorney over my financial affairs, allowing him to access my bank accounts, make investment decisions on my behalf, and even change beneficiaries on my life insurance policies. I had signed these papers during moments of grief or illness or confusion, trusting that my son had my best interests at heart. But the transaction records told a different story. Money had been flowing out of my accounts in steady streams, not just the large amounts I was aware of for emergencies, but smaller amounts for expenses I had never authorized or approved. Utilities, insurance payments, legal fees, business expenses for John's company, all paid from my accounts without my knowledge or consent. By the time I finished organizing everything, I had filled 2 large manila envelopes with evidence of what could only be described as systematic financial abuse. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 5 years, more than $400,000 had been taken from my accounts through various methods, leaving me with a fraction of what I had started with. But there was something else in those documents, something I hadn't expected to find. At the very bottom of the pile, in a folder I had forgotten about, were papers related to a trust fund that Thomas had set up shortly before his death. He had been worried about what would happen to me if something happened to him, so he had worked with an estate attorney to create a financial safety net that would ensure I was taken care of for the rest of my life. The trust was worth over $86 million. Money from Thomas's life insurance, investments he had made over the years, and property holdings I didn't even know existed. It had been sitting in a bank vault for 5 years, growing steadily, while I lived like a pauper and allowed myself to be exploited by people who thought I had nothing left to give. According to the trust documents, I was the sole beneficiary during my lifetime, with the remainder going to my children and grandchildren after my death. But here's the crucial detail. I had never been told about this trust. John, who had been handling my finances, had either never discovered it or had deliberately concealed its existence from me. I read those documents 3 times before the full implications sank in. I wasn't a poor old woman dependent on her children's charity. I was a wealthy woman who had been manipulated into believing she was destitute. I wasn't a burden on my family's finances. I was someone whose resources had been systematically plundered while she was distracted by grief and loneliness. The revelation was disorienting, like waking up from a dream to discover that everything you thought was real was actually an illusion. But it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't at the mercy of people who saw me as nothing more than a source of occasional financial support. I had options. I had resources. I had the ability to make choices about my own future based on what I wanted, rather than what other people expected of me. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of October chill that seeps through your clothes and settles in your bones. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Margaret Chen. Not the dowdy cardigan I usually wore, but a real outfit with a tailored jacket and proper shoes. I wanted to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. The law office was on the 40th floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the city. Margaret Chen was younger than I had expected, maybe 50, with short black hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room where we could spread out all my documents. "Before we begin," she said, "I want you to know that everything you tell me is completely confidential. My job is to understand your situation and explain your options, not to judge you or make you feel ashamed about what's happened." That simple statement of support nearly broke my composure. For months, I had felt like I was the one who had done something wrong, been too trusting, too naive, too weak to protect my own interests. Having someone acknowledge that I was the victim, not the perpetrator, of this situation was profoundly validating. For the next 2 hours, I told Margaret everything. The property transfers, the power of attorney documents, the steady drain of money from my accounts, the emotional manipulation, the threats about my mental competence, the discovery of the trust fund. She listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me tell my story at my own pace. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "Eleanor, I've been practicing elder law for 20 years, and I've seen every variation of financial abuse you can imagine. What's happened to you is textbook exploitation, and it's been done very skillfully by people who understood exactly how to manipulate your emotions and your trust. So I'm not crazy? I'm not just being paranoid or ungrateful? You are absolutely not crazy. What you've described is financial abuse, pure and simple. The fact that it was perpetrated by your own family members doesn't make it any less serious or any less illegal. Illegal. The word hung in the air between us like a revelation. I had been thinking of this as a family problem, a personal betrayal, a private matter to be resolved through better communication or clearer boundaries. I hadn't considered that actual crimes might have been committed. "What are my options?" I asked. "You have several paths available to you, each with different advantages and risks. First, you can pursue criminal charges. What your son has done, transferring property without your knowledge, using power of attorney beyond its intended scope, taking money from your accounts without authorization. These are felonies. If convicted, he could face significant jail time." The thought of John in prison made my stomach clench. Despite everything he had done to me, despite the years of manipulation and exploitation, he was still my son. The idea of being responsible for his incarceration was almost unbearable. "Second," Margaret continued, "you can pursue civil remedies. File lawsuits to recover the money that's been taken from you. Void the property transfers that were done without your informed consent. Revoke the power of attorney documents. This would be less punitive, but would still allow you to recover your assets and protect yourself going forward. And the third option? The third option is to focus on protecting your future rather than punishing the past. We revoke all existing financial arrangements, set up new structures that give you complete control over your assets, and make it clear to your family that any further attempts at financial manipulation will be met with immediate legal action. I thought about each option carefully. Criminal charges felt like nuclear warfare, devastating but perhaps more destructive than I was prepared to unleash. Civil lawsuits would drag on for years and keep me tied to people I was trying to distance myself from. But the third option, that had possibilities. If I chose the third path, what would that look like? We would start by revoking all existing powers of attorney and replacing them with new arrangements that give authority to someone you trust completely, maybe your granddaughter when she turns 18, or a professional fiduciary, or even keeping complete control yourself. We'd transfer the property back to your name, set up new bank accounts that only you can access, and draft new estate planning documents that reflect your actual wishes rather than what other people think they should be. And the trust fund? Margaret smiled. The trust fund changes everything. With $86 million in assets, you have the resources to live exactly as you choose for the rest of your life. You can travel, you can buy a new apartment, you can support causes you care about, you can restart your artistic career, whatever makes you happy. You're not dependent on anyone for anything. $86 million. The number was so large it was almost abstract, like hearing about the national debt or the distance to the nearest star. But it was real, and it was mine, and it meant that every fear I had had about being abandoned or left destitute was unfounded. There's something else, Margaret said. The trust documents specify that you can change the beneficiaries at any time. If your family relationships don't improve, if your children continue to treat you poorly, you have the ability to leave your money to other people, charities, friends, institutions that align with your values. The power to choose who would inherit my wealth. That was perhaps the most intoxicating prospect of all. For years, I had been treated as if my only value lay in what I could provide after my death. Now I had the ability to make that inheritance contingent on how I was treated while I was still alive. What would you recommend? I asked. Honestly, I think you should take some time to consider your options. This is a lot to process, and you don't have to make all these decisions today. But I would recommend that we start with some immediate protective measures, revoking the existing powers of attorney, setting up new bank accounts, and making sure you have complete control over your finances going forward. Everything else can wait until you've had time to think about what you really want. I left Margaret's office feeling like I had been given a new life. Not because my problems were solved, they weren't, but because I finally understood the full scope of my situation and had a clear path forward. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't at anyone's mercy. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I ordered takeout from an expensive restaurant, not because I was celebrating, but because I could. I sat at my kitchen table eating gourmet pasta and drinking a glass of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, and I felt free. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of legal and financial activity. New bank accounts, new investment arrangements, new estate planning documents that reflected my actual wishes rather than what other people expected them to be. It was exhausting, but also exhilarating, like cleaning out a house that had been cluttered for decades and finally being able to see the walls again. But I knew that the legal maneuvers were just the beginning. Eventually, I would have to tell my family what I had discovered and what I had decided to do about it. That conversation was going to be the real test of whether any of these relationships could be salvaged. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Sarah called on Friday evening, her voice carefully neutral in a way that told me she had been rehearsing this conversation. "Mom, I think we should talk. All of us. John and I have been discussing the situation, and we're worried that there might be some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up." Misunderstandings. Such a gentle word for systematic financial abuse and emotional manipulation. "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked. "Well, John mentioned that you seemed confused about some of the financial arrangements you two have worked out over the years. We're wondering if maybe you need some help understanding how your money is being managed." I almost laughed. After everything I had learned over the past week, after every document I had reviewed, and every transaction I had traced, they were still trying to convince me that I was the one who didn't understand the situation. "I think that's an excellent idea," I said. "Let's all sit down and discuss my finances. When would be convenient for you?" There was a pause, as if she hadn't expected me to agree so readily. "How about Sunday afternoon? We could meet at John's house." "Actually, I'd prefer to meet here in my apartment, and I'd like to have my lawyer present." Another pause, longer this time. "Your lawyer?" "Mom, that seems a little formal. We're family." "Yes, we are. And that's exactly why I think it would be helpful to have an objective professional help us sort through the misunderstandings you mentioned." "I don't think that's necessary." "Then maybe we shouldn't meet at all," I interrupted. "I've learned a lot about my financial situation over the past week, and I'm not interested in having another conversation where I'm told that I'm confused or incompetent or failing to understand arrangements that other people made on my behalf without my knowledge or consent." The steel in my voice seemed to surprise her. "Mom, please don't overreact. We just want to talk." "Then we'll talk. With my lawyer present. Sunday at 2 o'clock, here in my apartment. You can bring John, and I'll bring Margaret Chen from Chen, Rodriguez and Associates. We'll put all the cards on the table and see if we can sort out these misunderstandings once and for all." After I hung up, I called Margaret to confirm that she could attend the meeting. She was intrigued by the prospect of a family confrontation and agreed to be there to provide support and ensure that nothing I said could be used against me later. "Just remember," she said, "you don't owe them any explanations for your decisions. You have every right to control your own finances and make your own choices about how your money is used. Don't let them guilt you into feeling like you've done something wrong." Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that makes New York City look like a postcard. I had cleaned my apartment until it gleamed, more from nervous energy than from any real need for tidiness. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that I hadn't worn since Thomas's funeral, something that looked professional and serious, something that announced that this was not a casual family chat but a formal discussion of serious matters. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that comes from 20 years of dealing with difficult family situations. We reviewed the key points we wanted to cover and the documents we might need to reference, but mostly we just sat quietly, waiting for the storm we both knew was coming. John and Sarah arrived exactly on time, which told me they had probably been sitting in the car for several minutes, preparing their own strategy for the confrontation. John was wearing an expensive suit and his most charming smile, the one he used when he wanted to convince someone that he was trustworthy and reasonable. Sarah had chosen a more casual approach, perhaps hoping to emphasize that this was just a concerned daughter trying to help her confused mother. "Mom," Sarah said, kissing my cheek as if nothing had changed between us. "You look wonderful. This is your lawyer?" "This is Margaret Chen," I replied. "Margaret, these are my children, John and Sarah." The introductions were polite but strained, with the kind of artificial courtesy that people use when they're preparing for battle. We settled around my dining table, John and Sarah on one side, Margaret and I on the other, like opposing teams in a negotiation. "So," John began, his voice warm and reasonable. "Mom, Sarah tells me you've been having some concerns about the financial arrangements we've worked out over the years. I want you to know that everything I've done has been with your best interests in mind, and if there's been any confusion, I'm happy to explain anything you don't understand." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Before we begin, I think it would be helpful to establish what Mrs. Patterson's actual financial situation is. Based on my review of her records, she has assets totaling approximately $86.3 million, including a trust fund established by her late husband that has been growing for the past 5 years." The effect of this statement was immediate and dramatic. John's face went white, his mouth falling open as if he had been slapped. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, and she turned to stare at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. "$86 million?" Sarah whispered. "That's impossible." "I assure you, it's not impossible," Margaret replied calmly. "The documentation is quite clear. Mrs. Patterson is a very wealthy woman who has been living far beneath her means, apparently because she was unaware of the full extent of her assets." John recovered first, his face flushing red with what looked like anger. "Where did this money come from? There's no way Dad had that kind of money. He was a construction worker, for Christ's sake." "Your father," I said quietly, "was a construction worker who was very smart about investments. He bought property in Queens when it was cheap. He invested in the stock market consistently for 30 years, and he took out a very large life insurance policy to make sure I would be taken care of after he died. He set up a trust to protect those assets, and that trust has been growing ever since." "And you knew about this?" Sarah demanded. "I found out about it last week when I was organizing financial documents to bring to Margaret." I met her eyes steadily. "The question is, John, did you know about it?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between me and Margaret. "I might have seen some references to it in Dad's papers, but I didn't realize. I mean, the amount seemed inflated. I figured it was old information or something. So when you told me I needed to sell my apartment because I couldn't afford to maintain it, you knew I actually had millions of dollars in assets that could have paid for any expenses. It's not that simple. When you convinced me to sign over power of attorney because I was too confused to manage my own finances, you knew I was actually quite capable of managing my affairs and had substantial resources to work with?" "Mom, please, let me explain. When you transferred ownership of my apartment to yourself, telling me it was for my own protection, you knew that I had more than enough money to maintain that property and live there comfortably for the rest of my life?" John's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand how complicated these things are. I was trying to protect you. If word got out about how much money you had, every scam artist in the city would have been after you. I was keeping you safe. By lying to me? By stealing from me? By making me believe I was poor while you drained my bank accounts to pay for your own expenses?" "I didn't steal anything," he shouted, standing up so fast his chair tipped backward. "Everything I did was legal. You signed the papers. You gave me permission." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Actually, Mr. Patterson, several of the actions you've taken constitute financial elder abuse under New York state law. Obtaining power of attorney through misrepresentation, using those powers beyond their intended scope, and transferring property without the principal's informed consent are all felonies punishable by up to 15 years in prison." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at her brother as if seeing him for the first time. John's face cycled through several emotions: anger, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate cunning. "You can't prove I misrepresented anything," he said finally. "Mom was confused after Dad died. She needed help. Everything I did was to protect her interests." "Including taking $400,000 from her accounts over the past 5 years?" Margaret asked. "Including using her money to pay expenses for your business without her authorization? Including keeping her unaware of assets worth tens of millions of dollars?" She didn't need to know about every detail of her financial situation. "That's what power of attorney is for, so the agent can handle complicated financial matters without bothering the principal." I had heard enough. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 73 years in my aching joints, but also feeling a strength and clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. "John," I said, my voice steady and cold, "you have lied to me, stolen from me, and manipulated me for years. You have treated me with contempt and disrespect, and you have convinced me that I was a burden on your life when the truth is that you have been systematically plundering mine." "Mom, please." "I am not finished." The command in my voice surprised even me. "For 5 years, I have lived like a pauper while you lived off my money. For 5 years, I have felt guilty for asking for basic respect and consideration while you treated me like an ATM. For 5 years, I have apologized for being an inconvenience to your lives while you inconvenienced mine in ways I'm only beginning to understand." I walked to my desk and retrieved a manila envelope that Margaret and I had prepared earlier. From it, I pulled out several sets of legal documents. "These are revocations of all powers of attorney I have ever granted to anyone. Effective immediately, you have no authority over any aspect of my financial affairs." I set the first set of papers on the table in front of John, who stared at them as if they were written in a foreign language. "These are new estate planning documents. I have revised my will to reflect my current understanding of my family relationships. The bulk of my estate now goes to charitable organizations that work with exploited elderly people, with smaller amounts going to people who have treated me with genuine kindness and respect." I set the second stack in front of Sarah, who was crying quietly. "And these," I said, placing the final documents between both of them, "are the legal papers transferring ownership of my Brooklyn apartment back to me, along with a bill for 5 years of unauthorized use of my property." John grabbed the papers, scanning them quickly. "You can't do this. We'll fight it. We'll have you declared incompetent." Margaret smiled coldly. "Mr. Patterson, your mother has been evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists and a geriatrician, all of whom have certified that she is mentally competent and fully capable of making her own decisions. Any attempt to challenge her competency will be met with immediate criminal charges for financial elder abuse." "This is insane," Sarah whispered. "Mom, we're your children. We love you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a middle-aged woman who was genuinely shocked to discover that her actions had consequences, who had apparently convinced herself that taking advantage of her mother was somehow an act of love. "Sarah," I said gently, "if you love me, then show me that love through your actions, not your words. Respect my decisions. Respect my autonomy. Respect my right to control my own life and my own money. Stop treating me like a resource to be managed and start treating me like a person who deserves consideration and kindness." "But what about Christmas? What about birthdays and holidays? What about the grandchildren? What about them? Has my presence at those events ever been about my company? Or has it been about my contributions, the gifts I bring, the expenses I cover, the financial support I provide? When was the last time any of you invited me to spend time with you without expecting me to pay for the privilege?" Neither of them could answer that question, because the answer was obvious to everyone in the room. John was studying the property transfer documents, his face growing redder by the minute. "The apartment is worth $3 million now. You can't just take it back." "I'm not taking it back," I replied. "It was never yours in the first place. You obtained it through fraud and deception. I'm simply correcting a mistake. I've made improvements to the property. I've invested money in renovations and maintenance. With money you took from my accounts without my permission. I'm sure Margaret can help us calculate exactly how much of my own money you spent on my own property, if you'd like a detailed accounting." For the first time since the meeting began, John looked genuinely frightened. The bluster and anger were replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Mom, please. Let's work something out. I know I made some mistakes, but I was trying to help. We all were. Can't we find some middle ground here?" "The middle ground," I said, "is that you stop stealing from me and start treating me with basic human decency. If you can do that, we might be able to rebuild our relationship. If you can't, then we're done." Sarah was crying harder now, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know about the money he was taking or the apartment or any of it. I thought you wanted to help us." "I did want to help you," I replied. "I wanted to help you so badly that I ignored every sign that I was being taken advantage of. I wanted to be needed so desperately that I let you use me rather than love me. But I'm done with that now." Margaret began gathering the documents on the table. "Mrs. Patterson, I think we've covered everything we needed to discuss. John, Sarah, I suggest you take some time to consider what's been said here today. Your mother has been very generous in deciding not to pursue criminal charges, but that could change if there are any further attempts at manipulation or retaliation." John stood up slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "It is. It's been over for a long time. I was just too sad and lonely and desperate to admit it." As they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to me with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "Mom, what do you want from us? What would it take to fix this?" It was a fair question, and I gave it the consideration it deserved. "I want you to call me sometimes just to talk. Not because you need something. I want you to ask about my health, my interests, my dreams, my fears. All the things that make me a complete person instead of just your mother. I want you to invite me to spend time with you because you enjoy my company, not because holidays require the presence of certain family members. I want you to respect my decisions, even when you don't understand them. I want you to treat me like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. But you never told us you wanted those things. I shouldn't have to ask for basic respect and consideration. Those should be the foundation of any loving relationship." After they left, Margaret and I sat in my living room, both of us emotionally drained by the confrontation. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "But not the kind of tired I've been feeling for years. This feels like the good kind of tired you get after a long day of productive work." "Do you think they'll change?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Sarah might eventually, if she's willing to do some serious self-reflection. John. I think John is too angry and too entitled to change without being forced to. But you know what? That's not my problem anymore." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's not." That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not because my problems were solved. Family relationships are never that simple. But because I had finally stopped pretending that my problems didn't exist. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I heard nothing from John, which was probably for the best. Sarah called twice, both conversations awkward and stilted, as if we were strangers trying to find common ground. But Lily called every few days, just to check in and chat about school and friends and her plans for college. "Grandma," she said during one of our conversations, "I heard about what happened with the family meeting. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I told her honestly. "I'm free." "Good. You deserve to be free. And Grandma, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." It must have been really scary. It was terrifying, I admitted. But living a lie was even scarier. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I booked a trip, not a weekend getaway or a short vacation, but a real trip, the kind that requires planning and preparation and a willingness to step outside your comfort zone. I was going to Tuscany for 6 weeks to take a painting workshop at a small art school in the hills outside Florence. I had found the program online, reading testimonials from other older adults who had used travel and art to rediscover themselves after major life changes. The morning I left for the airport, I stood in my apartment looking at the easel by the window. At the half-finished painting of the city view, I had started the night I first refused John's demands for money. The colors were bold and honest, uncompromising in their depiction of urban life. It wasn't pretty in any conventional sense, but it was true, and that made it beautiful. I left the painting on the easel as a reminder to myself of how far I had come and how much further I intended to go. Italy was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. The light was extraordinary, golden and warm in a way that made everything look like a Renaissance painting. The other students in the workshop were mostly women my age, all of us trying to reclaim parts of ourselves that had been lost or hidden over the years. I painted landscapes and still lifes, portraits of weathered faces and architectural studies of ancient buildings. But mostly, I painted the feeling of freedom, bright colors and bold brushstrokes that captured the joy of being exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, without having to justify or explain my choices to anyone. One evening, as I sat on the terrace of the villa where we were staying, watching the sun set over the Tuscan hills, my phone rang. It was Sarah. "Mom, where are you? I've been calling your apartment for days." "I'm in Italy," I said, surprised by how natural it sounded. "Taking a painting class." There was a long pause. "Italy? By yourself?" "With a group of other artists. We're staying at a villa outside Florence, learning new techniques and painting the countryside." "You never told me you were planning a trip." "I don't need permission to travel," I said gently. "I'm an adult with my own resources and my own decisions to make." "But what if something happens? What if you get sick or hurt? What if there's an emergency?" "Then I'll handle it the same way I've been handling everything else for the past 73 years, with common sense and good judgment." Another pause. "John is furious. He says you're being reckless and irresponsible." "John's opinion about my life choices is no longer relevant to me. He's talking about having you declared incompetent. He says this trip proves you're not thinking clearly." I looked out at the rolling hills, painted gold by the setting sun, and felt nothing but peace. "Sarah, do I sound incompetent to you? Do I sound like someone who isn't thinking clearly?" "No," she admitted quietly. "You sound happy. Happier than I've heard you sound in years." "I am happy. For the first time since your father died. I'm genuinely happy." "I miss you," she whispered. "I know I didn't show it very well, but I do miss you." "I miss you too, sweetheart. But I don't miss being taken for granted. I don't miss being seen as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved." "Can we try again? When you get back, can we try to do better?" "We can try," I said. "But it has to be different this time. I won't go back to being invisible in my own life." "I understand. I think I understand." After we hung up, I sat on the terrace until the stars came out, thinking about second chances and new beginnings and the possibility that some relationships could be repaired if both people were willing to do the work. I returned from Italy 6 weeks later, tanned and rested and carrying a portfolio of paintings that captured not just the Italian countryside, but my own journey toward self-discovery. The apartment felt smaller than I remembered, but not confining, just cozy, like a perfect-sized space for a woman who had learned to value quality over quantity in all aspects of her life. The first thing I did was hang my new paintings on the walls, replacing the dusty photographs of family gatherings where I looked uncomfortable and overlooked. These new images were vibrant and alive, full of color and movement, and the kind of energy that comes from following your passion rather than simply fulfilling your obligations. The second thing I did was call Lily and invite her to dinner, not because I needed her help with anything, not because there was a crisis to be solved, but because I wanted to spend time with the one member of my family who had never made me feel like I was asking too much simply by existing. She arrived that evening with a bottle of wine and a curious expression. "Grandma, you look amazing. Like, seriously, amazing. What happened to you in Italy?" I remembered who I was, I said simply. I spent so many years being who other people needed me to be that I forgot I had choices about who I wanted to be. Over dinner, I told her about the painting classes and the other students and the feeling of waking up each morning with nothing on my schedule except what I had chosen to put there. I showed her the paintings I had brought back, and she studied each one with the kind of attention I hadn't received from anyone in my family in years. "These are incredible," she said. "They're like, I don't know, like they're alive. They make me want to travel and paint and do things I've never done before." "Then you should do those things," I told her. "Life is shorter than we think and longer than we fear. There's time for everything, but only if you don't waste it waiting for permission or approval from other people." Is that what you were doing? Waiting for permission? I was waiting for my children to love me the way I loved them. But I finally realized that love can't be earned through sacrifice or bought with money. It's either freely given, or it's not love at all. Lily nodded thoughtfully. "What about Mom and Uncle John? Are you going to try to work things out with them?" "I'm open to the possibility," I said, "but only if they're willing to accept that I'm a complete person with my own thoughts and feelings and dreams, not just a resource to be tapped when convenient." "And if they're not willing to accept that?" "Then I'll miss them, but I won't sacrifice my dignity to maintain relationships that diminish me." 3 months after my return from Italy, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a gallery owner in Soho who had seen some of my new work at a small exhibition of returning art students. She wanted to know if I would be interested in a solo show. "I'm particularly drawn to your Italian landscapes," she said. "There's something about them that feels both nostalgic and hopeful at the same time. They tell a story about transformation and self-discovery that I think would resonate with a lot of people." A solo show. At 73 years old, after decades of believing that my artistic dreams were impractical indulgences, I was being offered the opportunity to exhibit my work professionally. I said yes without hesitation. The opening reception was scheduled for a Friday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the day John had called me filthy and slammed the door in my face. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year earlier, I had felt worthless and invisible. Now, I was standing in a Manhattan gallery surrounded by strangers who were praising my work and buying my paintings. Sarah came to the opening, bringing her husband and both my grandchildren. She looked nervous and uncertain, as if she wasn't sure what to expect from this new version of her mother. "Mom," she said, standing in front of a landscape I had painted of the Tuscan hills at sunset, "I had no idea you were this talented. These paintings they're beautiful." "Thank you," I said. "I'm proud of them." "I'm sorry it took me so long to really see you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry we all took you for granted for so long." It wasn't a complete apology. There were still things we needed to work through, conversations we needed to have, trust that needed to be rebuilt. But it was a beginning, and beginnings are precious things, especially when you're 73 years old and thought all your new beginnings were behind you. John didn't come to the opening. I hadn't expected him to, and his absence didn't hurt the way it would have a year earlier. Some relationships can be repaired. Others are too damaged by betrayal and selfishness to survive. Learning to accept that difference has been one of the hardest but most liberating lessons of this entire experience. Lily, now 17 and preparing for college, spent the entire evening next to me, proudly introducing me to people as my grandmother, the artist. She had applied to art schools herself, inspired partly by my example and partly by her own growing passion for creative expression. "Grandma," she said as the evening was winding down, "I'm proud of you. Not just for the paintings, but for everything. For standing up for yourself, for choosing to be happy, for showing me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." That night, I went home to my apartment and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. A year earlier, I had been a lonely old woman living on what I thought were the charity and occasional attention of people who saw me as more of a burden than a blessing. Now I was an artist with a successful gallery show, a woman with enough financial resources to live exactly as I chose, and someone who had learned to value her own company enough to stop accepting poor treatment from others just to avoid being alone. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed. It was Margaret Chen, calling to congratulate me on the gallery show and to give me an update on my legal situation. "I have some interesting news," she said. "John's business is failing, and he's been trying to use your old power of attorney documents to access credit in your name. When the bank called to verify the arrangements, they discovered that those documents had been revoked. He's now facing potential fraud charges that could result in serious jail time." I felt no satisfaction in this news, only a kind of tired sadness for the man my son had become. "Is there anything I need to do?" "Nothing at all. The bank is handling it through their own security protocols. But Eleanor, I want you to know that you should feel proud of the courage it took to stand up to this kind of abuse. A lot of people in your situation never find the strength to break free." After I hung up, I walked through my apartment, looking at my paintings on the walls and feeling the weight of my own choices. I had chosen dignity over family harmony, truth over comfortable lies, solitude over exploitation. These had not been easy choices, but they had been the right choices for me. The last thing I did before going to bed was write a letter. Not to mail, but just to organize my thoughts and feelings about everything that had happened. I wrote about the pain of discovering that the people I loved most had been systematically taking advantage of me. I wrote about the fear of confronting that truth and the liberation of finally standing up for myself. I wrote about the loneliness of cutting ties with toxic relationships and the joy of discovering that I was strong enough to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. But mostly, I wrote about hope. Hope that it's never too late to change your life. Hope that dignity is worth fighting for. Hope that genuine love and respect are possible, even if they don't come from the places you expect them to. 6 months later, I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I bought a house. Not an apartment or a condo, but an actual house with a yard and a garden, and enough space for a proper art studio. It was in the Hudson Valley, about 90 minutes north of Manhattan, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that had inspired my most successful paintings. The house was a century old, with original hardwood floors and large windows that let in spectacular natural light. It needed work, but I had the resources to restore it properly, and more importantly, I had the time and energy to make it exactly what I wanted it to be. For the first time in my adult life, I was creating a living space that reflected my own tastes and needs, rather than accommodating someone else's requirements or budgets. The walls were painted in warm colors that made me happy. The studio was set up with professional lighting and enough space to work on large canvases. The garden was planted with flowers that bloomed in succession from spring through fall, creating a constantly changing palette of natural inspiration. I invited Sarah and her family to visit, and they came for a weekend in early summer. My grandchildren ran through the gardens and helped me pick vegetables for dinner. Sarah seemed more relaxed than I had seen her in years, repeatedly commenting on how peaceful and beautiful everything was. "Mom," she said on their last morning, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over the mountains, "you seem like a completely different person than you were 2 years ago." "I am a completely different person," I replied. "Or maybe I'm the same person I always was, just finally comfortable enough to be myself." "Do you ever regret it? Standing up to John, changing your will, buying this house? Do you ever wish things could have stayed the way they were?" I thought about her question carefully. There were things I missed about the old life: the sense of being needed, the illusion of close family relationships, the simplicity of letting other people make my decisions for me. But those things had come at too high a price, requiring me to sacrifice my dignity, my autonomy, and my sense of self-worth. I regret that it took me so long to recognize what was happening, I said finally. I regret that I allowed myself to be diminished for so many years. I regret that my relationship with John became so toxic that it couldn't be salvaged. But I don't regret choosing to live with integrity and self-respect, even when that choice came at personal cost. A year later, I had my second solo gallery show, this one featuring paintings inspired by my life in the Hudson Valley. The response was even more positive than the first show, with several pieces selling to collectors who appreciated what one critic called my honest portrayal of the landscape of aging and renewal. But the review that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. It was published in a small art magazine by a woman named Patricia Morrison, who wrote about visual art created by older adults. Eleanor Patterson's paintings are remarkable not just for their technical skill, but for their emotional honesty, she wrote. These are the works of someone who has looked directly at the difficult truths of aging, family relationships, and personal autonomy, and chosen to respond with beauty rather than bitterness. Her art reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to make choices based on your own values rather than other people's expectations, and to find joy in the simple act of creating something that reflects your authentic self. When I read those words, I wept, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of being seen and understood by someone who recognized the journey I had taken and the courage it had required. Lily started college that fall, majoring in art education with plans to become a teacher. She visited me regularly, sometimes bringing friends who were amazed by the transformation in my life and inspired by the possibility that you could reinvent yourself at any age. "Grandma," she said during one of her visits, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found out about the money? If you had just kept living the way you were?" I was working on a painting while we talked, adding layers of color to capture the way afternoon light filtered through the autumn leaves outside my studio window. "I think I would have died," I said simply. "Not physically, necessarily, but spiritually. I would have lived the rest of my life as a ghost of who I used to be, invisible to the people around me and eventually to myself." "That's really sad." "Yes, it is. But it's also amazing how much life you can still have, even in your 70s, if you're willing to fight for it." This past winter, I received a letter that I never expected to get. It was from John, written in his own handwriting rather than typed, which told me it had taken considerable effort to compose. "Mom," it began, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Not just sorry I got caught, but sorry for how I treated you. Sorry for all the years I took advantage of your generosity, and sorry for convincing myself that I was helping you when I was really helping myself." The letter went on to explain that he had been in therapy, working through his own issues with entitlement and manipulation. His business had failed, his marriage was struggling, and he was facing the possibility of jail time for the fraud charges. He wasn't asking for money or help or forgiveness, just acknowledging the harm he had caused and taking responsibility for his choices. "I know I destroyed our relationship," he wrote near the end. "I know I have no right to expect anything from you ever again. But I wanted you to know that what you did, standing up to me, refusing to let me manipulate you anymore, it was brave and it was right. I hated you for it at the time, but now I see that you were showing me the kind of backbone I wish I had developed years ago." I read the letter 3 times before deciding how to respond. In the end, I wrote back, not offering reconciliation or absolution, but acknowledging his apology and wishing him well in his efforts to become a better person. "The damage to our relationship may be irreparable," I wrote. "But that doesn't mean I take any satisfaction in your suffering, or that I don't hope you find a way to build a life based on honesty and respect for other people. If you can do that, then maybe some good will have come from all this pain." I never heard back from him, but I didn't expect to. Some wounds heal, others leave scars, and a few require the kind of distance that can only be measured in years and forgiveness that may never come. Learning to live with those realities is part of the wisdom that comes with age and experience. Now, as I sit in my studio on this spring morning, surrounded by canvases in various stages of completion and looking out at the garden that's just beginning to show signs of the season's first growth, I think about the strange journey that brought me to this place. 3 years ago, I was a lonely, exploited, invisible woman living in a small apartment and believing that her primary value lay in what she could provide to ungrateful family members. Today, I'm an established artist with a beautiful home, genuine financial security, and relationships based on mutual respect rather than need or obligation. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. There were months of loneliness as I adjusted to life without the toxic but familiar patterns I had grown used to. There were moments of doubt when I wondered if I had made the right choices, if I had been too harsh or too unforgiving. There were practical challenges as I learned to manage my own finances, make my own decisions, and take responsibility for my own happiness. But there were also moments of pure joy. The first time I sold a painting to someone who genuinely loved it. The first morning I woke up in my new house and realized I was exactly where I wanted to be. The first conversation I had with Sarah where she asked about my feelings instead of my bank account. Most importantly, I discovered that it's possible to love your family while refusing to be diminished by them. It's possible to value relationships while insisting on respect. It's possible to be generous without being exploited, kind without being taken advantage of, loving without being invisible. These lessons came at a high price: the loss of relationships I had hoped to maintain, the painful recognition of truths I had tried to avoid, the loneliness that comes with choosing integrity over convenience. But they were lessons worth learning, even if they came later in life than I would have preferred. If you're listening to this story and recognizing elements of your own experience, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever wondered whether you're loved for who you are or for what you provide, if you've ever sacrificed your own dignity to maintain relationships that diminish you, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose differently. You have the right to be treated with respect, regardless of your age or your financial situation or your family role. You have the right to make decisions about your own life based on what's best for you, not what's most convenient for other people. You have the right to be seen as a complete person with your own thoughts, feelings, dreams, and needs. These rights don't depend on anyone else's approval or permission. They're yours simply because you exist, because you matter, because your life has value that extends far beyond what you can provide to others. The path to reclaiming those rights isn't always clear or easy, and it often requires difficult choices that feel overwhelming at first. But on the other side of those choices is a life lived on your own terms, relationships based on genuine care rather than need, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're being true to yourself. I think about Thomas sometimes, wondering what he would have thought of the woman I've become. I like to imagine that he would be proud, not just of the paintings or the gallery shows or the beautiful house, but of the courage it took to recognize my own worth and insist that others recognize it too. He always believed I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. It just took me a few decades to prove him right. So tell me, have you ever found yourself in a situation where the people you loved most were the ones who made you feel least valuable? Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and personal dignity? Have you ever discovered that standing up for yourself was the scariest but most liberating thing you could do? I'd love to hear your story. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone in your own struggles or more hopeful about your own possibilities for change, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories, and maybe, just maybe, they'll reach someone who needs to hear them. Remember, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. It's never too late to insist on respect. It's never too late to choose love that lifts you up instead of love that holds you down. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for believing that every person's story matters, including